Hello. Welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Gann. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring to you another bonus episode of the Let People Prosper show. And this is one on the Human Reaction podcast. Be sure to go check it out wherever you get your podcast. It's a great discussion it's a great group. And I think that you will really enjoy the rest of their discussions as well. So be sure to go and subscribe to their podcast. Be sure to subscribe to mine too and share it with your friends and family. And we really have a good discussion breaking down what got me into economics, my time at the White House, the time during COVID and what happened during that whole period. Talked a lot about policies with school choice, property taxes, the overall economy, money supply, inflation. I mean, we really dig into all the key parts of this, and I try to explain them as simple as I can along the way. So you don't want to miss this episode. So without further ado, here's my episode with Human Reaction, talking about the economy. Don't miss it. We can't just look at the interest rates. The interest rates are just one price. What's driving those prices? The Fed's balance sheet. That is inflation. Right? Inflation is the Fed's balance sheet. That's the only thing that they control. That's why they shouldn't have a dual mandate. If we're going to have a Fed, and I'd love to talk about that, like I think we should end the Fed, move to a free banking system is really where my mind is at. The Fed causes too many problems. And you know, it does start though with Congress, like with excess spending and deficits. The Fed wouldn't have the ammunition it does without the deficits and debt.
Today, we're honored to have Dr. Vance Gann joining us on the show. He's a PhD of economics and an accomplished economist who champions free market solutions to let people prosper. He's the former chief economist at the Pelican Institute for Public Policy and previously served as the chief economist for the White House Office of Management and Budget. He's currently a senior fellow at Americans for Tax Reform, a senior fellow at Young Americans for Liberty. Vance is the founder and president of Gann Economic Consulting. Vance, thanks so much for joining us today. Your accolades are way larger than ours, so we're very honored to have you.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Well, let's start with the bio, man. Like, Obviously that's, procedure and everything, but what was it like to work at the White House and kind of your career and your story? Like, how did you wind up doing all this stuff?
Yeah, it's really wild. Like, I feel blessed to be where I'm at today. It's been a wild journey from growing up in South Houston, Texas, to my parents getting divorced when I was young, single mom, kind of low income, poverty, really, and I had the opportunity to go to private school from kindergarten to second grade, public school from third grade to sixth grade, or in homeschool, 7th grade through 12th grade. Started playing drums when I was 16, and we were talking beforehand about how we're all drummers, and that's when I got my start in drumming. I was 16, started playing with a hard rock band. I was living the rock star life. I'll just leave it like that, but I was living the rock star life, man. And I got in a serious car accident, May 25th, 2002, when I was 20. We were young, stupid, going 120 miles an hour, racing another car, ran into the back of a Suburban. We were in an Acura RSX. We rolled. I got life flighted at Herman Hospital in Houston, went home that night by the grace of God. And I had about like a month to think about, like, what am I going to do with my life? This rock star life isn't really heading in a good direction. I really felt compelled to let people prosper. And that's why I have like the Let People Prosper podcast show. But it also got me into studying economics, which I had just really got started and into. And I went from being a first generation college student to getting a PhD in economics. That doesn't happen very often, if you didn't know. But I mean, so it was a lot of work and everything else. And I started at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Actually, I worked at some universities for a while. Texas Tech University is where I got my PhD, taught economics there for a while, taught at Sam Houston State University for a little while in Texas, and then I went over to the Texas Public Policy Foundation because I really wanted to do policy where people actually read my work instead of writing in academic journals where nobody really reads this stuff. And that got me on this path to where I am today, to where, I worked in the White House in the Trump administration from June 2019 to May of 2020 as the chief economist. It's the technical title is Associate Director for Economic Policy, but it's the chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget. So I was right there in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, right next to the White House. Could go into, the West Wing anytime I wanted, the Navy mess. Found myself in the Situation Room as a person who was in homeschool, a drummer, and then, and back in the day, I used to dye my hair black and have like 10 gauge earrings in both ears and stuff, and for going to all that to like sitting in the Situation Room, making these big decisions was just remarkable. And then I went back to TPPF in May of 2020 after all the shutdowns and stuff happened. I was like, look, stuff is heading in the wrong direction. Let me get back home to Texas with my kids and family and everything. And then last year I started my own thing, Gann Economic Consulting. It was a leap of faith. faith where I just quit where I was and said, you know what, I'm going to try something else, and have been working with a lot of state think tanks across the country, including the Frontier Institute in Montana. And it's been great. Like I enjoy working on budgets, tax reform, occupational licensing reform, deregulation, just a lot of ways about like getting government out of the way. I'm a classical liberal, more libertarian overall. So I'm trying to find out how do we get people to do what they want to do? I know that I've failed many times. Y'all probably haven't, but I have a lot. And I learned from that. And too often, I think we get caught up in public policy and socialism and everything else, thinking like, okay, here's the utopia. But too often, if we don't fail, we're not going to learn, and we're not going to learn how to improve things over time. And now I'm, I got 3 kids and living near Austin, Texas, and kind of living my dream. So it's a long story, I guess, but I've tried to shorten it as much as possible. And I'm glad to be here with you talking today.
Oh, we appreciate it, man. That was really great. I mean, why economics? And then I did find it from your background to that. Well, I find a lot of people who get into economics have a moment or a story about how they got to that place where like, wow, this idea that things can order themselves on their own, that prosperity evolves from the bottom up, is really profound. And there was for me, there was a trigger point, but was there one for you?
Yeah, I think the big part for me was kind of to your point about it comes up from the bottom, not from the top down approach, that really got me interested. I remember when I took my first economics course in junior college, it was right when September 11th happened. It was in 2001. And I remember my economic professor was talking about how, wars help grow the economy and everything. And I was like, man, that doesn't make sense. That just doesn't make sense to me, because you're destroying things in the process. How can you be creating something and just because of government spending? And that kind of got me along that path a little bit more. And then when I got to Texas Tech, where I was studying intermediate macroeconomics, my mentor, ended up being my mentor over time, Dr. Ronald Gilbert, he gave me, I used to go talk to him after every class, and we would talk a lot about economics. And he handed me the book, Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, and it changed my life. I was like, this stuff makes so much sense. And it makes sense that, you should have control of your own destiny, not government, and that there are trade-offs within the system. And so that really helped to get me on my direction of studying economics. And the way that I look at economics is that it is about human behavior. It's the study of human action and interaction within institutions to satisfy our desires given scarce resources. That's the way that I like to define it, because it is about the human person. It's not about some economy or some stock market or something else. It's the study of how all those things work together. And so ultimately it's about individuals coming together, trusting one another with all these exchanges. And I think there's something beautiful to that really explains so much about how the world works. And I wish more people understood economics, and I think we'd be in a much better place.
I love that, because so much of economics is seen as like giant numbers and dial turning, right? We're going to dive into the jobs report here in a minute, but it's important to frame it up as the jobs report is a signal at the other end of a whole lot of human actions that all have real consequences for real human beings. Is that kind of where you're going with it? Am I thinking of it right?
Yes, exactly. Part of that has been from different types of economics or even economists who have made a big impact on public policy, on the economy, on the global situation. And Karl Marx is considered a classical economist. But from a perspective of you can have class struggles and you can have the government come in and redistribute things and how all that could work. It doesn't work, but that's what he argued. But then you had John Maynard Keynes, during the 1930s, when you had the Great Depression going on. In his view, he was saving capitalism through all this government, like you said, turning those wheels, the machine of the economy, and trying to help out things. But in the process, I think made us weaker. It extended the Great Depression. It made things worse over time, and it led to a lot of the dependency that we have today on government instead of on civil society. In fact, I think it crowded out. I know it crowded out the productive private sector because of all the government spending. If you include state, local, and federal spending, you're talking about 40 to 45% of the overall economy, meaning that's where taxes are having to take out. Think about how much more robust our economy would be, how much more jobs would be available out there in the economy, higher wages and everything else, had we not been set on this path over time. And I think it was good for those like Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, Thomas Sowell today. I mean, the man's 90 years old and still writing books. It's amazing. But these are the folks that I think we need to be looking up to more to say, you know what? This is a better path forward. No matter if it's in America or across the globe, capitalism works, socialism doesn't. And too many people, I just don't think, understand capitalism. They don't understand economics either, but they also don't understand capitalism. And so when you think about the jobs report, the GDP reports, a lot of stuff gets thrown out the top. I don't know, we're going through some of the details, but the new report today, even when it talks about that there's a lot of jobs that are being created. The headlines are going to be, oh, it's a robust labor market. And as I'll explain a little bit, it's actually a pretty weak labor market, and the data support that. So we've got to look below the surface. We can't just look at these top line numbers.
Jobs report. Let's dig into it. So so people don't know, the government puts out a bunch of numbers on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis, right?
Monthly.
On how the economy is doing in these certain measures. And then they go back and they review them. So we're going to dive into those. What's the takeaway? Like, let's catch up. Someone's never heard of a job report before in their life. Tell us about it. What's the takeaways from this month's?
Yeah, so the jobs report's put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is underneath the Department of Labor at the federal level. And they do different surveys. They do a payroll survey that goes out and asks questions of establishments. How many jobs have you added? How many have you let go? How much do you pay your workers? Kind of an average, things of that nature. And then there's also the household survey, which they ask a number of households, us, families across the country. I've never got a call, but they ask a lot of people about what their situation's like. Have they got a job? Are they over 16? Just normal things about the labor market. And then they put that information into their statistical analysis, and then they project what that means for the rest of the country, because they're not going to go out and interview every business or interview every household. So it is an estimate, approximation of what's going on in the labor market. And, I think there's some good information for us to look at and see how it does, especially over time. But what they'll report, the mainline numbers is that you will usually get will be the number of net non-farm jobs created. So that's really out of the payroll survey. So net non-farm, the reason why they use non-farm is because farming jobs they consider to be very volatile. And, it's usually family businesses and stuff. And so they're trying to look at more in the private sector, what's happening at the economy. They also do include government jobs. But that data out today, which they always report from the previous month, so we're on October 6th. It's the first Friday of every month is always when you can remember the U.S. jobs report's going to be. I remember when I was teaching economics, I'd always get the class excited. It's Jobs Report Friday, and then kind of go through all the details and stuff, kind of like we're doing today. It's Jobs Report Friday. Yeah. And so these numbers are for September, and they'll also do some revisions over the last couple of months. The headline numbers that we'll see is that the U.S. economy added 336,000 jobs. Employers added 336,000 net non-farm jobs, meaning that there were more jobs gross, like the gross number of jobs was greater added, and there were a lot that were let go as well. But on net, when you look at those, there were 336,000 more jobs than the previous month. But what's also interesting about this report is they revised the previous 2 months up by 119,000 jobs. So that was an increase. So look, we're looking at close more than 450,000 new jobs that were added, and it makes it look really good. I want to get to some of those details in a little bit, but the other big number that comes out is out of the household survey, which is the unemployment rate, remained unchanged at 3.8%, which also historically is very low. That's the near record low. It looks good on that side as well. And the other big thing that I think we should look at, and there's some other things that we can dig into, but it is average weekly earnings, like how much people are actually earning. And that went up 4.2% year over year. If you adjust it for inflation, inflation's running around 4% too. So there's really not much gain. Of the last 3 months, earnings have been essentially flat. And if you look at the last 2.5 years, basically since Biden got into office, wages are down for an average household is down about $7,000 when you look at different factors just since then, meaning that you can't buy as much of a basket. You're $7,000 poorer than you were when Biden took office. It's another reason why Bidenomics is a failure, and we can talk about that too. But when you look at those numbers, some of those things are going to be things that people are going to say, these are good signs of what's going on in the economy. But I would argue that it's still a weak economy, because if you added in the labor force that's dropped out since February of 2020, right before the shutdowns and everything happened with COVID, right? We're about 1.4 million fewer people that are in the labor force. You add them back in the labor force, and that unemployment rate would shoot up to about a little over 5%. So that's not good. The household survey also showed that employment increased by 84,000, not 336,000. So that's also pretty weak. So, and there are a number of other factors that are out there too that I think that indicate that this is a weaker labor market, and it goes along with a lot of the weaknesses we've seen in the overall economy, and it goes along with what we're seeing in the polling. I mean, polling is it's cratering how the consumer sentiment continues to fall as people just don't feel like this is a good economy. And the credit card debt has now exceeded $1 trillion. So the spending is still up, but people are just putting it all on their credit card and it continuing to go on even as interest rates continue to soar. So a long story short here is that I think that you're going to hear a lot of this is a strong report, but there's a lot of weaknesses that are in the labor market.
That's really interesting, Vance. I'm curious. I want to dig in on a couple of those things. So you noted that the reports that come out, they get revised after the fact and sometimes several months after the fact. Why is that done? And what does that indicate about the initial numbers that were given to us? Are they just inaccurate, or are they trying to hide something? What's going on there?
To take best case scenario, they're not hiding anything. It's just a matter of them getting more data as the months go on, and that there are what's called seasonal adjustments. So throughout the year, there are a number of jobs that are usually added for seasonal purposes, like during the summer, during Christmas, things of that nature. And so if you tease some of those out, you smooth out the data, you can say how many jobs are actually created compared to what they have been historically. Okay. And those seasonal adjustments, I think, are making a lot of problems in our labor market right now because it includes the last 3 years. I mean, it includes a lot of volatility during the shutdowns and then how they came up after that. And so there's a lot of garbage is what I'd say. There's a lot of garbage in these data, and garbage in, garbage out is, I think, what we're seeing within these data right now. And because we're seeing massive revisions of previous months every year. Now, that's historically always been the case, that there will always be revisions over the last couple of months, but not to the magnitude that they have been over the last at least 12 months. We've seen more than 100,000 plus or minus in either way. This shows a lot of instability that's going on with these data. And so I think we should take a lot of this data with a grain of salt, because my guess is this 336,000 jobs is going to be revised lower once we get more data that come in. And this won't really be smoothed out to have better labor market data month to month until I think at least another year, because when we get further away, especially from 2020, because we had the 22 million jobs that were lost during those just 2 months of, March and April of 2020. And then you started to see the increase over time, but that throws off a lot of these numbers that are out there. And so I think that that's part of it. There is the other side, though, where you say, you know what, maybe there is a reason for them to report these high number of jobs being created monthly and then go back and revise them later when nobody's going to care, because they can get the good top line numbers, good reports, and get all the good media that people will talk about, which we have a lot of progressive media, not y'all, but we have a lot of progressive media that's going on out there. And they're willing to tell more of that story than they will about the revisions, the loss of the people that are have dropped out of the labor force and everything else. That should be more of what the story should be.
The jobs that we've created in the last month, is that all full-time jobs, or is that part-time jobs and full-time?
Yeah, it's a combination of the two. I don't have the exact number, but what we've seen of the last few months now has been that the majority of jobs created on net, right, are part-time jobs. These are not full-time jobs, which is another indication of some of the weaknesses that are in the overall labor market. And there's a lot of talk about labor shortage, and where it's difficult. You have a lot of job openings by businesses, and that's the demand compared to unemployed, so the supply. And so there's been this gap, and that is what we call the labor shortage that's out there. And you wonder, I've got a little bit concerned about those job openings. Like, how many of these are really job openings? How many of them had taken on debt whenever interest rates were so low? Because now small businesses bankruptcies are up 61%. 61% just over the last year. A lot of small businesses are starting to fail, and and that means job openings are now falling as well. So they had this anticipation of hiring more workers, but I don't know that they really needed them based on the demand that they had at the time. And so now that gap is shrinking, and we're seeing a little bit more of it looks like a tighter labor market, but we've got a lot of uncertainty that's still out there. And so, it's another thing interesting about the labor market is people are jumping jobs a lot more. Well, why? Well, why is that the case? There's a number of reasons for that. One reason is I think that more people are wanting to look more for remote work. One thing that taught them about COVID was that they'd rather work from home more than being in the office, 40 hours a week. So they're looking for those jobs that will give them more flexibility, more fringe benefits and stuff like that. But it also, because of the inflationary pressure, that the overspending by Congress, the overprinting of money by the Federal Reserve, and all those things, they have to jump jobs in order to keep up. I mean, this is a tough situation for so many households. I'm blessed in the sense of my wife, she makes good money. She has her own business and we've got 3 kids. And so we can afford it. But a lot of the folks who are working paycheck to paycheck and everything, it's very difficult to make the ends meet at this point. And I don't see it really getting that much better for a while. Yes, inflationary pressures are down from 9% a year ago down to about 4%. But that 4% still high, and it's not catching you up from your wage growth that wasn't growing before that. So all this is influencing a lot of what's happening in the labor market.
That really explains why people feel like when they hear that inflation's down on like a title to some MSNBC article or something like that, that their intuitive feeling about their life and what they're seeing in the press is there's a huge gap there. Yep. There's like that human element that's saying, I can't seem to buy groceries without feeling like I'm going bankrupt. Yet you're telling me the economy's on the upswing and everything's okay. And this strange act by the Biden administration to lean into Biden economics and say, no, everything's great. Biden economics are working.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting too, because some Democrats are even telling the White House to stop talking about Bidenomics because they're hearing from their constituents a lot of the problems that we've just laid out in the labor market and what's going on in the economy. And they're like, let's push pause on this a little bit because this isn't going that well. You can only sell it so much. It's interesting too that they've started using Bidenomics so early in the administration. I mean, usually you don't hear about Trumponomics or Reaganomics or Bushonomics until at least after the first term.
Yeah.
We're still in all of this, but I think they did it because they wanted to sell to the American people the highlights. But unfortunately, it doesn't actually match what's happening in people's households. And that is starting to show a wider gap between what they're pushing versus reality. And I think we're going to continue to see that, over time. Unfortunately, I try to be optimistic. I'm an optimistic economist. Those things don't usually go together. But right now I do see a lot of pessimism. I don't know how to tackle all these things at one time, with the federal government potential shutdown, and we're running $2 trillion in deficits a year, and we're going to be paying net interest payments on the debt of $1 trillion a year. So what does that mean? We're rolling over debt with just new debt. That's insolvency. If you had a business or anything like that, this is insolvency that's going on, and interest rates keep going up, which means that the net interest payments on the debt are going to keep rising at a more rapid rate. And unfortunately, a lot of Republicans in Congress don't want to touch Social Security and Medicare, which we have to. And when I was in the Trump administration, Trump had already made this pledge, look, we're not touching Social Security and Medicare. It was actually on the back burner. We were going to do that more in the second term, but there wasn't a second term. But I think that these are things that we've really got to start looking at for the future of our country, for the future of our states, and more importantly, in my view, the future of the families.
Now, my theory is that the public choice economics just doesn't allow it happen, right? Yeah. Because there's just no incentive. As a person who's mostly spent most of my time, economics is like a hobby for me. My main gig is politics, right? And the political electoral side and the policy side. And with that, the only people who have an incentive to want to reform this are the smallest voting blocks in the country. Millennials, Gen Z, right? We're the ones who are going to put in $1 and get back 80 cents. If you're a boomer, you have no incentive, and they're the largest voting block. Yeah. So the question is like this. The way I visualize it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that there's a race going on to how insolvent can we get before enough of the boomers no longer are dependent on Social Security for their retirement. Because at some point, there's a young enough boomer that as a generation was like, I'm not depending on this system. It's going to be broke by the time I get there. And that became the norm, because that's the norm now. But at some point in, I don't know, the 80s or maybe the 90s, that this became the common way to think about your retirement. And then it might become politically possible, at least for Social Security.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, the votes matter. Public choice economics, that's one of my favorite with James Buchanan, which basically said that politicians, they work in their own their own self-interest as well, just like people in the private sector do. And so they work, they're rational people. But their decision-making process is different than those of us in the private sector, because what do they have to do? Win re-election. And so they have to, it's difficult for them to make these difficult decisions about Social Security, Medicare. It's a big problem whenever you put in these large government programs, which goes back to the failures of the FDR, effectively Delano Roosevelt administration, and what happened during the 1930s. I mean, they really set us on the stage for massive welfare state, a lot of the failures that we've seen, along with LBJ during the 1960s, and then added on to by Obamacare and Obama, right? But we've seen this stuff happen over time. And until we can change the narrative about how these programs like Social Security, it's not, I know there's a lot of talk about it's an entitlement. I don't think we're entitled to anything, because if you're entitled to something, if you're given a right to something, then the right can also be taken away by government. And in this case, it's not free. There's no free lunch, going back to Milton Friedman, right? Nothing is free here. There is a cost to it. And we're going to see this very soon. I mean, the actuarial data, which they look at, okay, what's the projected expenditures on Social Security, like payouts over time, versus the tax payments that are going to, tax revenues coming in. And I think it's now, 2026? It's coming up pretty quick. Maybe it's a little bit longer than that. But anyway, it's coming up the next 5 years on when it would reach a period of basically insolvency, where they don't have as much money. You're going to have substantial cuts. I think it's 24% cuts in benefits. And when those messages start to talk to boomers, like you said, and saying, hey, you're going to have some major cuts to this if we don't do something now. And I think that there's ways with Social Security to where, to get a little deeper, I don't even know that we need Social Security. I would rather the private sector work best. I think we should be able to be in charge of our own future. Why is the government automatically going to take our income to go into a fund that they're going to mismanage? Putting that hat off to the side for a second and living within reality that we're in today, okay, I think that we basically say, look, we need a certain cutoff to say below that, you need to choose private savings accounts or something else to go in. And then the other ones we're going to keep on the same system that we're on today. And then that way, I think will help with the political argument, but it's still a difficult argument, as you know, to go down that route. But I think we have to at some point, because that portion, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, are about 2/3 of the federal budget. 2/3. And so you only have about a third of the budget that you can really maneuver. And that's what they're talking about last week with the continuing resolution, or whenever that was here recently, I guess it was last week, continuing resolution. Yeah. That's all they're really talking about is the discretionary funding. They're not talking about the mandatory spending programs, which are really driving a lot of the deficits and debt over time. And so until we can get around that and define the narrative in a way that people can understand and say, you know what, we've got a crisis on our hands, we've got to do something about it. I don't see a path forward to where we actually do something, though, unfortunately.
So when we look at the kind of three variables he pointed to, that business owners are trying to project the amount of consumption they're going to see, right? The government came out with some numbers, said consumer spending in the last couple of years has been about 3.8%. And then they said 2 weeks ago, no, actually it was about 0.8%. So consumer spending was way less. Businesses aren't looking at the government for how consumers are actually going to spend. We don't want to confuse the signals right here, but this is the measurement. When businesses are trying to project out and saying, I need another person, what you're saying is that as they are saying, I need to hire someone so I can grow with the economy and bring in more income, they never found that person for a bunch of reasons, or there wasn't as much consumption as they thought. So all these signals are not working because of the junk in the signal. Like the price mechanism, as we've talked about in the show a lot, plays a role in society to signal to people what the available resources are and how to allocate those resources bottom up by people making these decisions. So business looks out and says, I need a new person, so I'm going to go find someone to hire. But then for some reason, they can't find that person. Or that person, like you're saying, might have different preferences now that they used to have. They don't want to work where you're at anymore. They want to work remote, or they want to work part-time, or whatever. So like, how would we understand what are the barriers and policy solutions so that when that business is seeing a growth in the economy, because the economy is, it might turn around at some point, that they can actually go out and find that person to employ? Yeah,
no, it's a great point. Yeah. Do you like the Austrian business cycle? Have you heard much about that?
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah. Well, it sounded a lot like what you were saying right there was the Austrian business cycle, because I think there's a lot of truth to it on the Austrian economics side, School of Economics, where they talk about whenever you manipulate interest rates in the economy like the Federal Reserve does, and like Congress's overspending does too, that creates distortions throughout the economy. And so you have boom and bust cycles that tend to occur whenever interest rates are held too low for too long. Then you have all this increase in production and hiring of new jobs and everything else, or the anticipation of hiring for new jobs. But when markets start to correct, including the price of credit, interest rates start to go back up, it makes it to where all those ideas, those investments aren't profitable anymore, and then they collapse. And what's interesting about all that too in economics, not to get too detailed in it, but it's called Cantillon effects, where you have the money that goes in the economy doesn't all go just like, so when the Fed prints money, it doesn't all go just to the lower income or even to the private sector, across the private sector, right? It really goes through the financial system first. Upper income people get it. It's like this trickle down, not the trickle down economics of tax cuts, but the trickle down economics of Federal Reserve's monetary policy. And it doesn't work.
Let me jump in there. This is the thing that drives me crazy right now, is because everyone is looking at BlackRock and saying BlackRock is why capitalism's bad. But when you have this, and you're totally right. My Capitalism Freedom, your book that turned you on, mine was Human Action.
Nice.
By Mises.
Nice.
So like again, that's how I got into economics.
I love that
so
book.
What drives me crazy is how many people are like, this over financialization, these giant financial firms, for example, capitalism was like, no, all of this financialization where everything is a financial product and everything is, there's so much money sloshing around there from the government, not to mention the 2008 benefits that the financial crisis gave to BlackRock and gave to these large financial institutions by bailing them out.
Yep.
You know, this is not an example. So how'd you react to that? Someone says, hey, BlackRock, you're a capitalist supporter. Why are you supporting the large financial institutions bringing in ESG and doing all these terrible things we hate?
Yeah. And it's because they have too much credit. They have too much liquidity on their balance sheet because the Fed keeps throwing more money at them. And to your point, bailing them out, all the TARP stuff that we had back in 08, 09 and the funding that went through them and just the Fed's balance sheet too. I mean, it's up to $8 trillion now. And before I forget though, I'm a huge fan of Eloy von Mises. Human Action, another one of my favorite books for sure. Hayek is another one, The Road to Serfdom. But yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. We have to understand the boom before we understand the bust. And most people will look at the bust first and be like, oh my gosh, all these people lost their jobs. These banks are failing and what's happening here and everything else. But it's like, how do we get there? We got there by manipulation of these markets early on, putting too much money into the system and everything else. And in Congress, what was it? The Dodd-Frank bill. It actually made it to where the bigger banks had even more support for them by Congress, and it weeded out a lot of the small and regional banks, making them even more of a systemic risk, if you will, to what happened during the 08-09 crisis. And that was after that. Dodd-Frank, I think, was in 2010. And so it was after all the crisis and everything. And now we're in the situation where these larger banks are having a lot of problems. Was it SVB? A lot of these other banks have had some problems. I think we're going to see more of the banks begin to fail as interest rates have went up. And they had all this liquidity. They put it a lot into bonds and other things that are out there. Those asset prices are changing quickly every day. And at the same time, we're seeing more and more people not being able to afford their car loans and their mortgages. And so that's going to deplete their assets quickly. And so again, we had this huge boom. Yay, all this stuff, throw money at everybody. And now the bust is in the process of happening. And a lot of people will throw off, be like, the Austrian economists are always talking about the bust happening. When is it happening? And my retort to them is that it is happening. We just may not always be seeing it. It's kind of, at least not on the surface, because a lot of this stuff is underneath the surface that's not out of plain sight based on government data, right? But if you look at what happened during 08-09, people will say, there wasn't any inflation and the Fed printed all this money, did quantitative easing and all this stuff. And they're like, look, Austrian economists, y'all wrong. And it's like, no, let's hold off a second, because stock market soared, bond prices soared. A lot of the prices throughout the system soared, where we had a lot of the bubbles that were taking place, and they continued to keep interest rates too low for too long during the 2000s, the aughts, the 2010s. Mm-hmm. And this has led to a big situation that is ready to burst. And right now, I think we're finally starting to get to some real interest rates in the economy, and people are freaking out. And if you look back in the 1980s, we got to look to the past to understand what's happening for the future. 1970s, government printed too much money. They were looking at this debunked Phillips curve, the trade-off between unemployment rate and inflation. And Milton Friedman, that's where he got his Nobel Prize on, was actually debunking that Phillips curve. It's ridiculous. And then Paul Volcker came in, slammed the brake on the printing of money, actually cut the money supply for a while, and it led to a double dip recession that people were like, oh, well, that, what happened there? But then you had a period of like great moderation. I'm not saying they did everything perfectly there, but there was some things that took place that really changed the dynamic. And unfortunately, I don't see that dynamic changing right now. There's too many people who want to put more money in the economy through the Fed, through Congress and everything else. And so what I've been saying, like if I'm on Fox Business with Cavuto and others, or I'm like, look, we can't just look at the interest rates. The interest rates are just one price. What's driving those prices? The Fed's balance sheet. That is inflation, right? Inflation is the Fed's balance sheet. That's the only thing that they control. That's why they shouldn't have a dual mandate. If we're going to have a Fed, and I'd love to talk about that, like I think we should end the Fed, move to a free banking system is really where my mind is at. But yes, the Fed causes too many problems. And it does start though with Congress, like with excess spending and deficits. The Fed wouldn't have the ammunition it does without the deficits and debt. And debt just hit $33 trillion. They come in, they buy that debt, they print the money. What if we were reducing the debt? That would also put less power in the hands of the Federal Reserve as well, which I think would be a better direction.
It's really interesting. I'm going to jump in here because this is going a million miles a minute for the average Joes in the audience like me. Yeah, I think there's a lot here to break down and a lot that people need to understand. Well, you mentioned that these indicators, right, things that you look at to know the health of the economy, and sometimes they're a little skewed, and sometimes we have to wait months to get the real numbers. If somebody was looking at the economy feeling like, hey, I'm not seeing this prosperity that Bidenomics is saying I should be feeling, are there any leading indicators people can look at and sort of easily understand to see, what's actually happening? What can I plan for? What am I expecting in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are indicators that people should look at. If I'm not an economist and looking at this stuff every day, what I tell my friends and family and others is like, just save for a rainy day. Like make sure that your own house is in order before you start worrying about other people's houses and everything else, right? I wish politicians did that too, but that's a whole nother discussion. But I really think that people should be looking out and saying, how is my finances? Let me save for a rainy day. So if I lose my job, I'll still be in a good situation. Because what happens is when you start getting into a situation where you're living paycheck to paycheck and everything else, if something happens and there is a recession and you lose your job, you're going to be in a much worse situation had you not planned and saved ahead for, 6 months or how many ever months you can to have that money in the bank. I think that'll be really helpful for you. And, those who are looking more at like investing and putting in stocks and bonds is, I still look at Burt Malkill's Random Walk Down Wall Street book that really helped me to understand a lot about the stock market. Is you want to be in there for the long term. I have quite a bit that's invested in stocks and exchange traded funds and things of that nature, but I look at it more from a longer term perspective and let my income drive my more spending today. And I think if we were more conservative on our own budgets, that would be a better scenario for us and for people out there to be ready for whatever is going to come. Because unfortunately, I do think that there's going to continue to be a lot of volatility that's out there, both politically, which unfortunately politics drives a lot of stuff, which is one reason why I want to shrink government. Government's too big, so it's influencing a lot of our lives. But it also means that there's going to be repercussions when it comes to education, healthcare. I mean, all this stuff is intertwined in our economy. And what my approach is on the Let People Prosper sort of calling or vision that I try to do is to say, the way we prosper is by putting ourselves in the best situation that we can. And that way we're not as reliant on government and everything else. And if for us, right, if we get Social Security later, great. But I'm not going to depend on it. I'm not going to bet on it. Yeah, I'm not going to count on it.
Yeah. Totally. Well, and you mentioned volatility and with the banking instability that you mentioned as well with SVB and Signature Bank. There's been some recent news about Bank of America having some questionable things on their balance sheet, and there's maybe some uncertainty around Bank of America. Do you have any comment on like what's going on there, how to understand that or look at that?
Not a whole lot other than, I think that we need more audits. We should be auditing a lot of these banks. We should be auditing the Fed. We should be finding out exactly what is on these balance sheets because it's all going to come home to roost. And at the end of the day, this money is what's sloshing around out there, and it's what's being invested and a lot of it with our taxpayer dollars. In a free market capitalist system, that's not how the economy is supposed to work. Prices, y'all were mentioning this earlier, prices are what should direct resources for consumers and the producers, not government intervention. And there's a big divide right now, and I'm sure y'all talk about this some, of like the nat cons versus free cons, and all national conservatism and freedom conservatism. And on the right, there's a big divide that's happening. And the industrial policy part of this is really concerning to me, because when government starts to control resources and plan things, it fails time and time again because it doesn't allow for the prices signals to allocate resources efficiently. And what does that do? It makes us less prosperous. It makes us poorer in the process. And this is something that, really concerns me longer term.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of debate right now. I think you're right. Like the conservative movement is in a state of flux when it comes to its relationship with economics, right? There's, for a long time, I remember my first time being in DC, 2013, and I was talking with some folks, and I was like, I'm a newly born econ nerd at that time, like only 5 years old. And I was like, yeah, talking about international trade. And this trade deal was coming up. We're talking about like the early steps of TPP. Mm-hmm. And I remember everyone around me was like, well, of course, trade is good. And like, why isn't it even a fight? And I was like, I don't think you guys understand. Back home, a lot of people on the ground are very skeptical of these trade deals, and they really don't like them. And everyone in DC was like, no one's ever going to not be pro-trade. And then all of a sudden, one guy comes along and says like, hey, you can get elected by saying, trade has some costs and we need to pay attention to those costs. And all of a sudden now it's completely different. You go to DC now and everyone's just like, oh, trade. It's easier to talk about abortion than it is to talk about trade in DC sometimes. So do you sympathize? Is this how you see it too?
Yeah, I do. Free trade. And I don't look at trade just being international borders. The basic part of economics is trade between individuals. I always try to break things down to one-on-one. If you can't really explain it to one-on-one, to individuals in the marketplace, then if you try to take it to a macro economy, it breaks down. And so just like if I want to tax someone more to give to someone else, there has to be less production in the economy because you only have the two people. That's the same thing if you have an entire economy, because it's taking money out. And trade is so important in our lives every day that we don't even think about it. I live near Austin, Texas. I'm exchanging with a lot of companies that are around here, and there's that trust that takes place within those trades because of the price signals and everything else that's going on. There's a lot of trade that happens across state borders, Texas and Montana and others that are out there. But as soon as we start talking about other countries, it's like, oh man, something's wrong. But I think we need to get in to redefine the narrative that it's not America trading with China. It's Americans trading with the Chinese. Now, we could talk about some of the problems. It's not the same rules of the game, which I think are important. I think that we do need to recognize that there are some issues with China. They don't play by the same rules of the game. They're a communist country. They're subsidizing a lot. They have a lot of industrial policy. Their economy is going to fail before ours does, though, if you look at what all is going on over there. And so when I would have conversations, and I had a lot of these, as you might suspect, when I was in the Trump White House. So I'm a free market guy, right? I mean, I told you all my economists who I like and everything else. And so I'm not for tariffs. And when I would talk to folks like Peter Navarro, Robert Lighthizer, I didn't get to talk to the president as much about that, but those guys, they were very much like, okay, China's a massive threat. They're an existential threat to America. They're taking all of our our intellectual property, our IP, and basically they are producing all this stuff and stockpiling it, reducing the prices of steel and other things artificially in the marketplace. And so we've got to do something about it. So what are we going to do? Let's put in tariffs. Let's put a 25% tariff in place. Let's put all these other tariffs and stuff like that. And, I get it from the surface level, going back almost like a full circle we were talking about earlier with the jobs report. Is you go to the surface level, I get that stuff. And they'll argue that trade with China is what hurt the Rust Belt and put a lot of people out of jobs. I think the evidence and the research on that is different, though. It was more from automation. It was more from the high cost of doing business at home that incentivized people to move to other countries. And it just so happens that China has 1.4 billion people and has a lower cost of wages and everything else, and a lot of rare minerals that you can buy things at a much cheaper price. So we would buy it from there. But it was a lot of other things that were happening here. And one way I like to put this is that, we often have, when we blame someone else like China, we've got one finger pointing at them, but we've got three other fingers pointing back at ourselves. And I think that we need to look more internally about what we need to do. When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act went in place, the Trump tax cuts, they cut the corporate tax rate. I wasn't there at that time, but cut the corporate tax rate from 35%, which is the highest in the developed world, to 21%, which is now above the global average. So they need to lower it even more. But that helped to incentivize people to come back home. We were raising our cost. And so we were looking at blaming everyone else for our problems when we should have been blaming ourselves and doing more here at home to fight these battles. And the other thing here, and I'll stop on this issue and be glad to answer your questions, but is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was with 12 countries, including the United States, Canada, Japan, Mexico, Taiwan, a lot of East Asian countries. To me, that would have been the best path forward to go after China. Because China does not care. They're a communist country. They don't have elections, okay? They don't care if their people are starving in different places or if we're putting tariffs, which remember, tariffs are just taxes on Americans. It might hurt China in the sense that maybe we don't have to pay that higher tax and they don't have to produce as much to export to us, but it really hurts us in the process and raises prices, especially for the poorest among us who buy things from Walmart and other places. It's going to drastically hurt them in the process. So you put that to the side. But if you looked at the TPP, the big argument by Trump and others was that it was not negotiated very good by the Obama administration. I probably agree with that. It had a lot of green energy nonsense and other stuff in there. But why didn't the Trump administration just come in, instead of throwing it out, just renegotiate it? And I think that would have been a better process, because now you had a huge block of countries, major countries. I think it was 60%, 65% of the global GDP would have been a part of this. Or no, it's closer to 45%. Sorry, 45%. I was getting my number turned around, but 45% of GDP. Still a lot though, okay? That would have been within this block. And if China didn't want to, deal with the same sort of trade agreements that we had with these countries, they wouldn't have been able to do trade. It would have substantially hit their economy, and I think it would have forced them more so than what tariffs would do to a more open market policies, because they would have lost so much in power and everything else in this marketplace. And so again, I always go back. It's Americans trading with Chinese. It's Americans trading with Mexicans. It's not America trading with China or Mexico. And I get a lot of pushback for that, and that's okay. But I think that we've got to look back at the principles. Yeah,
I'm with you, Vance. It's exactly if you look at it from a geopolitical stage, if you want to disentangle American economics, supply chains from China, the best thing you can do is cut a trade deal with Japan and Korea.
Yeah.
But then they tanked that, right? Don't get me wrong. Maybe it could have been stronger. Cato did a really great review. It was hey, it's got these problems, but in net, it reduced trade barriers, and then imagine after COVID, while COVID was going on, and we couldn't get anything from anywhere around the world because all the trade lanes were shut down. All the ports, remember all the reporting on the ports and how jammed up the ports were were at the time. If we would have had a brand new trade deal at that time that lowered barriers and didn't have all the cronyism and didn't have all the baggage of the Obama administration, because Trump had prioritized that instead, it might have been a lot smoother transition after the end of the pandemic. It might not have been as brutal up until this point even. We would be substantially more prosperous now if we had less trade barriers between us and most of the world outside of China that we would be benefiting from at this moment. So I think that's really, right. As thinking geopolitically, it makes the most sense. And I just can't understand why the anti-trade fervor got to that place, because this isn't NAFTA. This isn't some other issue. This is this issue, right? Which is crazy to me.
Well,
if I could just straw man. Go ahead. No, please. Go ahead.
If I could just real quick, because it's such an important topic that's going on right now, because it leads into a lot of other issues that's going on, right? But it's populism, right? It's populism because it gives us someone else to blame, and it gives us a target that we can go after instead of doing something about it ourselves. And that's with immigration. Another thing that I always get a lot of, accolades when I talk about, I'm for more legal immigration. I think that the issue on the border is real. I live in Austin, Texas, or near Austin, Texas. I don't claim Austin. That's why I keep saying near Austin, Texas. I live in Round Rock, which is just north of Austin. I don't claim the People's Republic of Austin. But along the border is a major problem. It's a humanitarian crisis that's going on there. That something needs to be done. And a lot of the cost is put on Texas. Our taxes, we've spent, I think it's $15 to $20 billion over the last 5 to 10 years of state taxpayer dollars to fund what's going on down there. And that's an issue. But like, if you build the wall or just say, look, we're just going to stop the number of people, we're still going to have other ways to get around the wall. These people are coming here to prosper. They're leaving places like Guatemala and Central America and all these places that are having a lot of strife and other issues. And they're trying to come here for a better way of life, right? I don't see why we shouldn't find ways to get them here. A lot of these are entrepreneurs. And if we had a better legal visa system, then instead of these quotas and other things that are out there, maybe a market-based system, right? Prices matter. I would love to see the day where we have visas. You can have like an auction on the visas and maybe businesses pay for who's coming over because they need the workers, and you can allow for markets to work instead of government controls on the system. I think we would free up a lot of this underground economy that's going on within the illegal immigration that's happening across the country, or Texas in particular, California too, some. But the same arguments are for free trade or against free trade are against immigration. That they're taking our jobs, they're lowering our wages, they're a major cost, they're driving up welfare, and it's like, but why? Well, maybe our welfare system is too giving to Americans in the first place,
and it's already illegal to do that. Like,
it is illegal.
It's illegal for illegal immigrants to commit fraud and get Social Security. So just like with Second Amendment issues, if you make it illegaler, it doesn't go away. Like, that's not how it works.
No. And it doesn't.
So you're right. So you want to do is create an incentive for them to participate in the clear economy, which would be exactly what you're saying. Lower the barriers so then they can be here as legal citizens to work.
Yes. And markets work too, right? Like, there's not just one labor market. There's not just one market for trade. The last point here that I'd make is that there are many markets. There are high-skilled workers, there are low-skilled workers, there are mid-skilled workers. Who do they actually compete with? So the literature in these areas is that, trade doesn't lower wages because the people that you're trading with are usually the same income levels. And so you're competing within that particular marketplace, and you can actually allow for more division of labor and specialization to happen, and therefore more production and economic output and prosperity and all that stuff. The same thing is for immigration. They are competing with that particular part of the labor market, not the entire labor market. So you can't come out and say that all wages are going down. It depends on where the marketplaces are. And you also have to look at the other side, that they also demand more goods and services whenever we are trading with other countries, right? And if we have more immigrants, they're also buying more goods and services. So there's a demand and supply scenario in those labor markets, which is why wages don't go down.
So I'm going to touch on inflation stuff because that's still, I think, the major pivotal issue of our time right now is how to deal with inflation. Because everyone remembers stagflation as a theory, right? We can watch, Free to Choose and be like, yeah, seems like a major issue.
Can we define stagflation really quick, just for everybody who might be listening and not know what that is?
Yeah, what's stagflation? What was it? Tell us about the 70s.
Yeah, so stagflation is a period of economic stagnation where the economy is just kind of churning along. There's not really a lot of economic growth. Maybe the unemployment rate is staying pretty high. During the 1970s, we had double-digit unemployment rates for a while. And then the inflation part of it is just high inflation. So there were also double-digit inflation rates during the 1970s. And so this period of economic stagflation is what it's called, is a period of economic stagnation and inflation. And we've had that recently where we've had slow economic growth. The unemployment rates remain low, but that's because so many people have dropped out of the labor force. So if you drop people out of the labor force, you're going to bring down the unemployment rate arbitrarily, or artificially, I should say, and which doesn't really reflect what's really happening in the economy. I actually don't like the unemployment rate. It's not really telling us much about the economy. You want to look at the labor force participation rate or the employment population ratio, something like that, because the numerator, the unemployment, the number of unemployed, and the denominator, labor force, are both volatile. They can both move up and down. And it doesn't give you a good signal about the market, the labor market. Whereas if you look at the labor force participation rate, it's the labor force, which can be volatile, but the population on the denominator, which is more stable. And so that gives you a better picture of what's happening in the labor market. And so there was a lot of talk about this stagflation in the 1970s, and it hurts Americans. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think it's driven a lot by the Federal Reserve. We go back to that again in Congress. But yeah, we've seen it again, and unfortunately.
But the question is why did all the greedy corporations raise their profits, and therefore by raising their prices and cause inflation? That's my strong.
Yeah. So
I think it's the most common narrative. Like it's so hard to debunk. It's so hard to get people off this, but this is a common question people are going to get where they need a good economics answer. How would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, if they were always greedy, then why are they just raising prices now? I mean,
they got together at their corporation owning meeting and said, it's time to raise prices, guys.
Right.
In a smoky room over cigars, they're like, we're going to do it.
With monocles. Yeah. I'm envisioning monocles. Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, this is one thing that I try to do a lot with the progressive left and even some on the right, honestly, is I try to ask the question back, like, how do they answer this question about why are they just raising prices now? Because if those companies are greedy, a lot of them are the same companies that were there before, most all of them. Why weren't they always raising prices? Greedflation is a myth. There's not greedflation. In fact, we're all greedy to a certain extent. That's why we want income. That's why we're working. You know, the way that we as humans work is that we save in order to consume. What does that mean? We save some of our time that we could otherwise be doing something else to work. We don't want to work necessarily. I think it brings dignity. I think it breeds respect. If I even came from a biblical perspective, I think God called us to be fruitful and multiply, right? Multiply is something else. But fruitful is important about work to where I think it's in us to do that. But we like our leisure time. You know, we want to spend time with our family and do other stuff that's out there. Spend time on, social media or whatever it is. And so when we're looking at all these different factors, I don't see how corporations are just going to be greedy just whenever there's time of inflation. It would be all the time. And the other part that I like to push back on them is, aren't politicians greedy? How much more money do they want from me? How much more money do they want from businesses to be able to redistribute out of the system when taxation is theft, right? This is money that you're taking from me. I get it. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist either, but I believe in very limited government. And so whenever I'm thinking about these things, that's the area that I'm really trying to find. Okay, what's the roles for government? That's something else that I think we need to get back to, is what are the roles of government, and them coming in and saying whether or not companies are greedy, or a lot of the antitrust policy that's happening right now by the Biden administration and Alina Khan over at the Federal Trade Commission, Cantor at the Department of Justice on their antitrust division. I mean, these are really scary parts of what's happening right now in America, that they are trying to go straight after these quote unquote big tech companies and others, calling them monopolies. And from my viewpoint, kind of going to human action and Loewe Mises, is that there are not private sector monopolies. As long as there aren't barriers and everything else which are created by government, that there is always the threat, the potential for new entrants to compete in the marketplace. And so we don't have monopolies. The only monopolies we have are government entities that are monopolies. They should be breaking down government monopolies. They should be breaking down government schools that are causing a disaster for our education system. They should be breaking down the healthcare system where they are making us have higher prices and less optimal outcomes for the healthcare sector. That's really where we should be going at. Not calling greedflation for all these profitable corporations and everyone else. Is that instead, let's make sure that we're removing any sort of one area where I would agree with them to some extent is all the handouts, the corporate welfare to businesses. But again, that's a government failure. That's not a market failure. That's not capitalism. That's socialism. That's not capitalism. And so I think we've got to be able to do a better job of separating these out. And I think too, that this is an area where fiscal conservatism, sound economics really needs to be talked about more. In my view, there's not quote unquote conservative economics. There's not roles for industrial policy in the economy to direct resources. That is going to set us up for failure. And unfortunately, too many are doing it across the country.
I am curious though, who do you think from the Republican primary field has the best economic policy at this point, from what you know?
Yeah, it's an interesting field for what's going on. I was hopeful that Governor DeSantis in Florida would talk more about the Florida model. I've done a lot of work in Texas. I was coining a lot from when I was working at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, kind of the Texas model. And I think that's worked well for a while. I think they're kind of going in a wrong direction now, but Florida's been getting a lot of things right for a while. And so I thought Governor DeSantis has a lot of things to go on. Unfortunately, I think he's moved too much in the woke stuff with Disney and other things going on. I understand that populism gets a lot more votes probably, but I think it's taking it in the wrong direction from my view. But I do hope that he can get some things together. I like Vivek Ramaswamy. I think he talks a really good game. I don't agree with him on everything. I don't agree with any of them on everything for sure. But I think that he has a good game. I met him at Young Americans for Liberty. I emceed their recent Revolution conference this year and met him there. Great guy. I think he talks a good game. He talks about ending the Fed. He mentioned that, several times. Who else, though, I think has been talking a good game lately, and I don't agree with her on everything, but is Governor Nikki Haley from South Carolina. Like, she's actually talking about cutting government spending. Now, that's an uphill battle, but at least she's talking about it, because to me, the ultimate burden of government is not by how much it taxes, but by how much it spends. Who said that? Milton Friedman. And we've got to look at government spending, and it's what I do a lot with my life's work, is finding ways to cut, limit, do whatever we can to go after government spending. If we're going to keep spending, we got to keep taxing. If we're going to keep spending, we're going to keep regulating. You can't regulate, and you don't need to tax if you don't spend it. So spending is really where the problem is. And the excessive government spending, especially at the federal level, is also what's driving all the problems with monetary policy in the Fed. And so we could also get control a lot of what the Federal Reserve's doing if we just had more sensible, responsible policy at the federal level. And I just released, so I'm a senior fellow at Americans for Tax Reform. And Grover Norquist and I, he's the president of America's Tax Reform. We just had a piece out in the Wall Street Journal talking about that spending is the problem. Now, we know that, but we actually put numbers to it, to where there's a website, atr.org/budget project, where you can go on and you can compare every state with how they look compared to like something like population growth plus inflation, the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending. And we wrote about that in the Wall Street Journal. And so I think that we need more of these candidates talking about the excessive government spending that's happening and everything else. And I don't know, I guess those are kind of my three that I've been watching so far. And I mean, I think Trump he's going to be there. It's going to be an uphill battle, I think, for any of them, but we'll see where that kind of goes.
One of the things I thought was interesting, took me by surprise because he's not well known for his passionate defenses of the free market, was Governor Chris Christie in the last debate responding to artificial intelligence. Had a really great, typical populist sort of tee up from Fox Business, and then he absolutely smashed the answer, which is, the articulating a light regulatory climate for AI, and especially when it comes to labor markets, there's a lot of fear. Do you have any thoughts about how should we think about the effects that AI might have in the labor marketplace?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work with the Pelican Institute in Louisiana, and they do a lot of tech stuff, and I've been writing more on tech. Most of my stuff's like fiscal policy work and some poverty relief initiatives, but I've been doing more in the tech space because I think that it's the wave of the future, right? If we don't get this right with technology and everything else, it's going to stifle our ability to prosper in the future. And I'm really concerned that not only from the FTC, like the antitrust stuff that's going on with AI, but also even, Elon Musk, who doesn't live too far from where I'm at here in Texas. I think he gets a lot of stuff right, but at the same time, they were like, look, let's put a pause on AI. Like, are you serious? Like, why would America put a pause and then China and other countries, they're not going to push pause? It's kind of what gives me, and we didn't even talk about this, but climate change, right? Like, how are we going to stifle this if America, which we're actually cutting carbon emissions, if carbon emissions is really creating global warming and all that. So let's just assume that it is right now. We're actually going down. Whereas China and other places, India, they're going up. And so you can't control it that way, just like you can't control AI. And I think that we can't be scared. That's what I see right now is a lot of fear, right? There's a lot of fear about AI, artificial intelligence, what the future is going to hold, how it's going to, quote unquote, take the other jobs, just like we were talking about earlier with free trade and immigration, that these AI are going to take our jobs. And I just don't believe any of that stuff. I mean, if you look at recorded history and creative destruction, another good economist, Joseph Schumpeter, that's another good plug there. But what he talked about is that you need creative destruction that's going to happen over time. And I don't think we should fear it. I don't think it's a role for government to come and bail out everybody out either. And because I know we're going to hear a lot about that. Well, we need a universal basic income, a UBI, and all this other nonsense. And it's like, no, just let the marketplace work, free them up. If you're going to do any regulations, make sure that it's really light. And so that way we can move forward. Because to your point, though, Governor Christie was saying is like, look, if we shut this all down, we're going to be losing out in the process, because AI is going to improve our lives. And from my view, over time, and that we will be able to overcome the obstacles that we have by adapting, just like we're going to deal with changing weathers, because look, the climate is always changing. I don't know if y'all knew that, but the climate's always changing, whether it's man-made anthropogenic global warming or whatever else. As you can tell, I'm not a huge believer in that, but I think that's what's great
Climate
about science.
denier.
Yeah, I know. But I think that's what's all good about science is people will say, oh, the science has told us. Well, that's not how science works. Science is constantly moving forward to test different hypotheses. There's not one science. And so we need to keep thinking about these things. But the more and more research that I've seen and evidence and everything else is kind of the opposite, because really what I believe what they want more when it comes to AI, when it comes to the big tech companies, when it comes to climate change, is not so much about what's best for people. It's about control. And they believe that they are the experts, the tyranny of experts, where they can come in, they can solve the problems and make everything better, which is why Congress gets in the way, presidents get in the way, the Federal Reserve gets in the way. I mean, we need to have rules in place. I'm a big fan of rules, whether it be a fiscal rule like a spending limit for states, local governments, and the federal government. I'm not a huge fan of balanced budget amendments because then you can raise taxes and taxes don't solve the problem. It just makes the problem worse. You really got to focus on spending. And I'm also a fan of monetary rules, something like the Taylor rule or even a money rule. If we're going to have the Fed, first of all, if we're going to have the Fed, I think we probably will for a while, then we need rules in place that can get away from the discretion that we have otherwise, because then we're left to whatever these experts think that they know. And these rules are always wrong too. It's made by man. We're fallible at the end of the day. But I think it helps us to create more certainty in the marketplace instead of the uncertainty that's driven by politics.
Speaking of trade-offs, like what are the trade-offs there if we fail to get spending under control?
Yeah, so the trade-offs, for a long time, it's been tough to talk about government spending and the cost of it. I mean, I could talk about it, the trade-off with the private sector. There's no free government spending, so every dollar comes out of the productive private sector whenever they tax us. And that's one way, but I think people, they don't really connect it to that. And I could talk to you about how our national debt, which is $33 trillion, how that's about $100,000 per person. So each of us owe $100,000. Or per taxpayer, though, it's close to $250,000. Actually, more than that now, as it has increased so rapidly. So I think we're all taxpayers. So we owe actually over $250,000, but our kids owe $100,000. And so that starts to connect a little bit. But people are like, we're not going to have to pay it off. But I think we're starting to see this more now, to where it's starting to connect with people more, because the cost of this excessive spending are the deficits and the debt, the interest payments, and those interest payments and that debt are sold in the marketplace, and it pushes the price of bonds down and interest rates up. So we're seeing interest rates soar. Well, the Federal Reserve doesn't always want interest rates to go up because they have their target interest rate, the federal funds rate, and all that. So if it starts to go above where they want it to be, they'll buy more bonds, they'll put more money into the marketplace and all of that, which increases inflation. And so what we've seen now are the direct results of the excess spending and everything else is that inflation, higher interest rates, you losing your mortgage, you losing your car, you losing your business because of all this, goes back to excessive government spending. I think we have a direct connection now of all these things starting to go together, and we can see the trade-offs today. It's not something that we can just say, oh, this is going to happen in the future when you have to pay your taxes. No, you're facing this now, which is another thing that we haven't even really talked a lot about, but I think that's why we're seeing so many strikes by the UAW workers, the United Auto Workers, other strikes that are going on across the country, is that they can't keep up with inflation. It's creating a lot of strife. And so they are wanting to push back, even though I think it's going to make the situation worse for the economy and even for them, because some people are going to lose their jobs. But it's all driven by the excessive government spending. And we've got to get back to, what are the roles for government? In my view, I think that the roles for government are, national defense, in the sense of having order within the marketplace. Because if we're always being worried about being shot or killed, or just a lot of going back to uncertainty, right? The volatility that happens. Like if you're in the Middle East, it's difficult for your economy to work because you don't know what's going to happen. A suicide bomber and everything else, it's very difficult for economy to work. So I think that some of that security is important. Not too much though, because then it can go in the other direction, like the Patriot Act and stuff. But then you also have, I think a justice system that's blind, I think is important, because it's difficult for us to judge each other without just like shooting each other, or something like that. So I think a justice system is important, and maybe some public goods. It's difficult for me to think a lot about those, but maybe there are some. My dad had epilepsy growing up, or when I was growing up, and he died from sudden unexpected death and epilepsy. And maybe there are some people where it's very difficult for civil society to help them. I think it wouldn't be if we weren't taxed so much, but right. But we're in that situation now. So maybe there are some roles there, but that would be a much smaller government than what we have today. I mean, we're up to what, $5.5 trillion with a T in federal government spending. The national defense, our Department of Defense running around $850 billion. I don't think it actually needs to be that much. I love to see the Defense Department audited, and there's a lot of waste that's there that we could be spending that money more wisely. But let's say we just took $850 billion. You took the justice system, another 100 or so billion. So let's say it's $1 trillion. $1 trillion compared to the $5.5 trillion means $4.5 trillion more dollars in the productive private sector. That way we could help each other out more. And we talk about some of this with the breakdown of the family and everything else, and how we can support them more through child tax credits and other things. That's putting Band-Aids on the problem from a government solution when government is the problem, in my view. And when you do that, you make two wrongs don't make a right. And it makes the problem worse. And so, I know it's a long way to say it, but government spending is the problem. And we see the trade-offs now. They're all around us. And we've got to make this known more, which is one reason why, like, I do my Let People Prosper show podcast and love being on with folks like you to really talk about these things, because I think we need to talk about them more. I mean, for better or worse, we don't have the Milton Friedman of the world anymore. I think there are a lot of other good economists that are out there, but you don't have someone who's going into the universities and going right against the progressives, going on the Phil Donahue show and going right after that stuff. I mean, I think Loewe, Mises, Hayek were great economists, but they did not have the same sort of way of explaining things to where people can understand, like Milton Friedman did. And I don't agree with everything Milton Friedman wanted to do, but I think he had this way of changing people's minds just by, and it was kind of funny is on YouTube, you can watch all of Milton Friedman's, a lot of his speeches. I still go back and watch those speeches because I'd love to learn how to make sure that I'm explaining this in the easiest way possible. And there's so much good stuff that's there. So anyway, I'll stop.
We've hit our major topics, and man, this was really great. Thank you, Vance.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I know I did. Thank you to the Human Reaction folks over there. Please go check out their podcast, rate and review them. Please rate and review the Let People Prosper show with Vance Ginn. You don't want to miss that one as well. And then find the show notes at vanceginn.com, along with a whole bunch of other resources that I provide. So thank you for listening today. And until next time, let people prosper.